Welcome once again to When the Facts Change, economics and politics in a fast-moving world, with me, Liam Halligan. Now, there's a growing sense in the UK that our civil service, once the envy of the world, has become bloated and highly inefficient. Some even argue, including a number of senior politicians, that far too many civil servants operate like activists, frustrating policies they don't like, which invariably means those put forward by centre-right governments. Oxford-educated Ameer Kotecha, on the civil service fast track and clearly destined for the top, recently resigned from the Foreign Office. Kotecha joined the civil service in 2015, working across Whitehall before going on to serve as a diplomat in Israel and then Russia. Kotecha resigned, he said, giving up his dream of becoming an ambassador because he felt the Foreign Office and the civil service more broadly no longer serves Britain's national interests. It's certainly true that the broad-based public sector has seen productivity fall. It's flatlined for years in contrast to the private sector. What's more, since 2016, the number of civil servants has increased by a third, the service becoming bloated and hugely expensive, not least the cost of extremely generous index-linked pensions. On top of this inefficiency, many at the top of the Tories and Reform think that an overwhelmingly left-wing civil service needs not only stripping back, but root and branch reform. If not, they say, Britain will be unable to tackle some of the country's most pressing problems, including immigration and the spiralling welfare bill. Kotecha may be young, but he's a genuine Whitehall insider whose decision to leave and personal testimony certainly adds to the weight of that case. Welcome once again to When the Facts Change with me, Liam Halligan. Ameer Kotecha, great to have you here on When the Facts Change. Just tell us how long you spent in the Foreign Office.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. So I did 11 years in...
God, you must have started as a child.
I did a couple of years in the private sector and then went straight in to the Foreign Office. So on the diplomatic service fast stream, they called it. 2015, I joined and I left last month after resigning from my final role, which was head of the Palestinian section in Tel Aviv.
It's a pretty big deal. I mean, obviously you're an extremely well-educated young man, joking aside, picked up by the civil service, fast track. I mean, You're living the dream, aren't you? This is the British dream. This is maybe why your family came to the UK. Young Ameer gets into the Foreign Office at the highest level, heading for the top, future ambassador.
Yeah.
What happened? Why did you leave?
Yeah, I mean, look, and I always dreamed of being a diplomat, and I'm incredibly grateful to this country for letting my parents in. And it is a British dream in some ways. I mean, I left essentially because I felt the Foreign Office wasn't focused enough on the national interest, right? And that feels like an easy criticism to make, but it feels quite fundamental to me, right? I think, foreign policy making should be an exercise in looking at the world, deciding what's in the UK national interest, and then pursuing that doggedly, right? And that actually feels kind of fairly obvious. But I don't think we're doing it at the moment. And particularly under this government, I feel they're distracted by, the national interest comes second to international law and a very sort of rigid, almost unquestioning worship of international law.
Unlike a lot of the European Union, for instance.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, we it's good to pay heed to international law and use it as a bit of a guide, but sort of unquestioningly, slavishly following, its every requirement, when it clearly conflicts with the national interest, like on this Chagos giveaway, I think is totally wrong. So in some cases, the national interest is playing second fiddle to international law. And in other cases, the national interest is playing second fiddle to sort of domestic sectarian voting considerations, it seems to me. And I saw that on Israel-Palestine. I think it's also true to some extent on Iran. And I found both of those things, really shocking, because it just seems to me that there are things that we are obviously not doing because there's a sense that, Labour backbenchers and the sectarian voting bloc back home might not agree with them. Or there's things that we should be doing that we're not doing because Starmer feels like the international lawyers and his Attorney General won't like it. So it just feels
his friends, in other words.
His friends. And it just feels to me that that's not a way to conduct your foreign policy.
Okay, let's talk for the first part of this interview, if we may, about the Foreign Office in particular. You and I have got something in common, not just that we're both from proud immigrant stock, but also, you spent the early part of your career in the former Soviet Union, as did I. Obviously, a place with difficulties, but tremendous commercial opportunities for the UK, albeit with the ebb and flow of the sort of geopolitical cycle, if you like. And then we'll talk about the civil service more broadly, because I think a lot of people looking into the future of British politics are thinking, okay, we've got a centre-left government for now, but that isn't always going to be the case. There's clearly a reckoning coming. The civil service is absolutely huge. It's a third bigger than it was in 2016, and a lot of the public don't trust it. And I know you care a lot about the civil service. I know you're very proud to have been a civil servant, and you didn't leave lightly. But it is interesting, I think, that you're speaking out. So before we move on to civil service in general, let's talk specifically about the Foreign Office and your experiences in the Foreign Office, and how you feel sometimes the interests of the insiders can often outweigh the national interest. My experience of being a foreign correspondent, various parts of the world, is that I'd always know the Irish diplomats, because that's my other nationality, and I'd know the Aussie diplomats, and I'd know the Canadian diplomats. Of course I did. Of course I would. That's just a kind of natural thing. And it always seemed that other English-speaking countries' embassies were pushing trade, commerce, the balance of payments, return on tax dollars, a lot harder than our civil servants. Our civil servants, would talk endlessly about political theories, and they'd talk endlessly to me about, who's up and who's down in terms of, ambassadors in various parts of the world, but very little emphasis on trade. Am I being unfair?
No, I think there's a lot there which rings true to me. I mean, I didn't focus on trade in my career. My Foreign Office career was much more about national security and sort of the high politics, as it were, rather than trade. But I do think there is a bit of a problem there, which is that in the Foreign Office, there is a bit of a sense that trade plays second fiddle to more sort of political work. And people don't seem to want to do the trade jobs in the same way that they want to be the head of the political section, right? So there's a bit of a problem there. I also just think, we don't really have the right people in the civil service. We don't have people of a commercial background. We have very few people, for example, who've come from the private sector. So I think even if the Foreign Office and DBT and the other bits of government, even if they did really put the emphasis on
Department of Business and Trade.
Department of Business and Trade, which has been through so many iterations.
Oh, crikey.
I think,
what does that mean?
yeah. I mean, I think 2023 we had the Department of
Business. Name calling, plaque changing.
Exactly.
Which speaks to our point, really.
Speaks to the point. And so I think even if they put the emphasis on it that we should have, I'm not sure we really have the right skills and talents within our civil service to be world-class at export promotion and striking trade deals and all the rest of it. So there's a real problem there. We need more people from the private sector. We need people of a commercial acumen. But I also think, Liam, in really simple ways, the Foreign Office doesn't really seem to think of how it can push UK business and push UK exports just in the sort of everyday diplomatic drumbeat. So for example, I got very, very upset at the fact that we weren't serving British food and drink produce at our embassies around the world. And I wasn't just the only one upset. Ministers were getting very upset because you had an absurd situation where ministers were travelling to the British Embassy in Paris or the British Embassy in Washington or the British High Commission in Delhi, they were sat with their opposite numbers, the foreign minister or the trade minister, talking, for example, about reducing Scotch whisky tariffs, and the whisky in the glass over the dinner wasn't even Scotch. It was some, American bourbon or some local stuff. And it sounds like a small
Talk
thing.
about missing a trick.
Yeah,
it's not a small thing. It's
ministers
huge.
were getting really upset by this, right? So what I then found is ministers came back to London. They came back to Whitehall. They said, that's not good enough. We need to do a better job of serving British food and drink at the table at our embassies all around the world. And this wasn't just, Liz Truss famously was very kind of passionate about this.
Yeah.
Cheese markets and pork markets. But it wasn't just Liz Truss. I mean, Boris Johnson before her, Liz Truss, James Cleverly then took up the mantle on this. They all really cared about this agenda. But
Rightly so.
But the blob, they just didn't seem to get it. And there was all sorts of resistance. And I wrote a Times column when I left, and I said that ultimately what killed it was the lawyers who basically said it was contrary to procurement law to serve British produce in a British embassy. They said, there's no rationale, there's no justification in procurement law to favour a British supplier over a non-British one, right? And to me, that just seems to exemplify the problem.
Absolutely insane.
Yeah.
Crikey.
I think it is.
You mentioned there the phrase, the blob, unprovoked. Is it a thing? What is it?
So look, the blob, I think, was it Michael Gove who came up with the term, I think. But, I think Dominic Cummings today is probably the person most famously critical, I guess, of the civil service.
Of course, Boris Johnson's chief political advisor.
Yeah.
Controversial character.
Indeed.
But somebody who I think a lot of insiders feel, if they're honest,
he had a lot of
puts his finger on quite a lot of germane problems.
Yeah, exactly. And I personally think that many of Cummings's ideas are right. I think how you actually implement them, perhaps it could have been done in a slightly different way to actually stick. But his ideas are absolutely spot on in many cases, and I think. The blob, what does it mean? It's basically just this sense that the civil service is very resistant to change, sclerotic, and doesn't really seem to get what almost everyone in the country can see, which is that all is not well in the government machine, right? I think it's just...
So emphasising process over substance, emphasising inputs rather than outputs, emphasising the letter of various regulations rather than what's actually in Britain's interests.
Exactly, and results, right? There doesn't seem to be any focus at all in the civil service on results. And it's all about the process, and it's all about behaviours, which is how the civil service recruits. Are you a good manager? Have you shown sort of an empathetic leadership style? Have you shown a willingness to sort of learn and develop and change? These are all perfectly good things, but they're not, as important as an ability to ruthlessly...
It sounds like you're talking to a 10-year-old, maybe a 15-year-old.
Yeah. And the problem is, if you look at Antonia Romeo, the new cabinet secretary, just yesterday or the day before yesterday, she took the decision to publish her objectives, right? And this was seen as a big thing, because for the first time she's saying, well, hold me to account on what I'm setting out to do. But, the fact that we don't have this as a matter of course across the civil service is extraordinary, right? There's almost no proper KPIs. Civil servants are
Key performance indices. And there's not, am I right in saying, I've certainly heard this said from people who should know, that a lot of the usual, appraisal procedures that we've had in the past have fallen by the wayside.
Yeah, exactly. So the Foreign Office got rid of...
How can that be?
Well, the rationale that the Foreign Office gave, and it wasn't just the Foreign Office, I think it was actually most departments took this decision to get rid of appraisals as part of the appointments process. So if I'm doing a job at the British Embassy in France, and I want to go for my next job at the British Embassy in Italy, you apply for that job. It's an internal sort of process, but you don't. That the hiring manager never sees your appraisal. They can't see what you actually achieved in your previous job. And the reason they got rid of it, the official justification was, it was disadvantaging certain protected characteristic groups, the ethnic minorities or women, weren't scoring as highly in their appraisal box markings, and the extrapolation from that was there must be an unconscious bias there, rather than trying to improve the system, rather than try and
encourage people to raise their game, perhaps.
Exactly, or if there was any unconscious bias, I'm not sure there really was, but rather than trying to stamp that out, they just decided to abolish the use of appraisals altogether in appointments. So, I mean, it's an absurd situation where essentially you go for a job and the person hiring you has no idea what you've achieved in your previous job. So,
even though the taxpayer has funded you, your appraisal, all that process,
Yep.
the next person hiring you isn't allowed to look at that appraisal.
Exactly. And this goes right through the organisation to the very top. This is not
That's mad.
It's mad. It's not just the junior grades. This is right to the very top. And what it speaks to is a broader culture, which is the civil service aren't that interested in actually what you've achieved in tangible, concrete terms. They're interested in whether you can talk the talk, sort of use the right civil service jargon, whether you sort of, look the part, though I would say that many of our senior civil servants now look pretty shabby coming into the office. But, there's a focus on that rather than results.
I'm often amazed when I go into various Whitehall departments. I mean, I must say, I think, in general, the top politicians are reasonably well turned out, though not always. I saw a minister the other day giving a speech and she was wearing tracksuit bottoms.
Yeah.
And, maybe I'm just sounding a bit old, but I just thought, hang about, you're a minister of the Crown. It's actually a cabinet minister. And several people in the audience, I was doing a speaking event after she left, said, is that what we're paying for?
Yeah. I mean, look, dress is not the most important thing, but it is, I think it does speak to a bigger point, which is there is this endemic work from home culture, which is a real problem, civil service.
But it's meant to increase productivity. Whatever.
I mean, ministries in Whitehall are deserted on Fridays, and I'd encourage your listeners and your watchers to just go to Whitehall on a Friday and look at how many people you see streaming out of government buildings. It'll be very, very few, because there's an endemic work from home culture. Civil servants are only required to come in 60% of the time, so 3 days a week. And even that, the unions don't want to do. So a week ago or 2 weeks ago, the biggest civil service union said that PCS, because of the Iran conflict, because of the increase in petrol prices, the 60% rule should be scrapped, and civil servants shouldn't have to come in even 3 days a week because they need to save.
What about a bloke driving a van to work? He hasn't got any choice.
Well, exactly.
Someone working in manufacturing, they haven't got a choice.
And civil servants aren't even driving in anyway. I mean, the vast majority of them
are getting on the tube
right? So it was a totally sort of cynical position for the union.
How did you feel about that? You've obviously, I know a little bit about your background. You've worked very hard. Your parents worked very hard. I'm from a similar background myself in many ways. And then you get to the top, you're in the Foreign Office, crikey, here it is, Whitehall. Your relatives elsewhere in the world say, wow, he's in the Foreign Office. And you've got people, saying, oh, I'm not coming in today. I'm not coming in tomorrow. How did that make you feel? You must have been quite disappointed.
Yeah, I was. And the problem really is not so much with the rank and file civil servants, though there are absolutely some who are coasting. The bigger problem is with the senior management, because they don't encourage people to pull their socks up, to come in. There's a sort of sense that to get tough would be unkind, would be lacking in empathy.
Well, you're dealing with other people's money. It's a public sector attitude, isn't it?
Exactly. And so, a director or a director general, they think that if they, get tough, they might lose the support of rank and file officials. That might harm their career. So there's very little attempt that I see on the part of senior management to get tough on this stuff. And on your point about, the Foreign Office and how it feels, and this sort of sense of working in a great institution. I think what's really interesting, Liam, is if the Foreign Office really did feel like a great institution, a sort of mighty, powerful place, which was, calling the shots, and which, felt empowered, and the UK felt like it had influence on the world stage, I think people would be willing to, for example, be paid less than they might be paid in the private sector. People would be willing to put up with some of the frustrations that are just part and parcel of working for government, because they feel like they're working somewhere unique and special, right?
Prestige.
For the prestige thing. And one of the things that really demoralised me is that sort of prestige thing, that sense that you're working in a really, really special, not just department, but institution.
Yeah.
The senior management did very little to really cultivate that. I mean, there was even a conversation a few years ago about getting rid of the whole concept of the diplomatic service. They wanted to just call it,
Are you telling, are there sort of wokesters at the top of the civil service who are actually ashamed of our history? Did you ever come across that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the idea of...
Just to explain that for us, how must that felt to you? That must have blown your mind.
Yeah. I mean, look, I wrote this Times piece where I spoke about World Afro Day and being invited to World Afro Day at the very time where Kabul was falling to the Taliban. That was an egregious example, but there was lots and lots of instances of that. There was an Islamophobia Awareness Month. There was Windrush Day. There were BLM events. And there was also just a constant sort of self-flagellation about the building we were in, this colonial building. So, for example, there is a big statue of Robert Clive of India outside the Foreign Office. I'm not saying he was a fantastic man. I think actually he was expelled from school for being a troublemaker, and he probably took that into adulthood. But the point is, we were having these constant kind of pointless conversations about whether or not, the statue should be pulled down.
These people still think they're at university, don't they?
Yeah.
But they're actually being paid by ordinary people to...
Yeah, exactly. And there was similarly conversations about, the building and aspects of the building that people didn't like. I mean, you may remember about 18 months ago, a whole bunch of senior retired, or not retired, but former Foreign Office officials, Lord Sedwill, the former Cabinet Secretary, was one of them, Mozzam Malik, Tom Fletcher. They wrote a pamphlet setting out changes that they think the Foreign Office should make to modernise itself. And one of their suggestions was to move into less colonial digs, right? And to rename itself, because they thought the name was too colonial with Commonwealth in the title. So they wanted to call it the Department for International Affairs or Department for Global Affairs. They spoke about how there were too many colonial-era portraits on the walls. And so, if you've got even uber senior mandarins pushing this stuff, then of course rank and file officials, almost jump on that bandwagon. And I said that, I even had colleagues, former Department for International Development colleagues, which then merged with the Foreign Office, you may remember.
Yeah.
And they even said to me that they weren't coming into the office. They were insisting on working from home because they didn't want to work in a colonial building. Right. So I think, that's what we were dealing with.
Are we talking about quite senior people?
Some of them were senior, some of them were more junior.
But they don't want to come into work because they don't want to work in a colonial building.
Yeah. Their argument was they joined the Department for International Development. They were into development and humanitarian issues. If they hadn't joined...
and now it merged with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and now they don't want to come to work.
Exactly. And they said that, frankly, if they hadn't joined the Department for International Development, they would have gone to Amnesty International or the UN or Save the Children. They did not see themselves, Liam, as British civil servants or as British diplomats or as British Crown servants. And that cuts to the heart of it, because they saw themselves as humanitarian workers or international sort of development consultants. And so it's little wonder that our aid spending is therefore so poorly spent, and it's not, spent in a way that's instrumental and serves the UK interest. I mean, I think that if we are to have an aid budget, it's got to be tied far more closely with our national objectives and our national interests.
Yeah, you distinguish between emergency relief aid, which is one thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, that is of cardinal importance. I'm sure you would agree.
Absolutely.
But then there's a much broader aid budget. Is it things we choose to focus on, choose to back, and you feel that should be more tied? Because it is taxpayers' money.
It's taxpayers' money, and there's absolutely no reason why we can't serve our own national interest while still doing good in the world.
That's right.
So, for example, we give all this money to Pakistan, for example, but then, are we asking them to take back Pakistani nationals that are languishing in British prisons that we're trying to deport?
Yeah.
Right? There's absolutely no reason why we can't add a bit more instrumental logic behind our aid spending, so that we say, yes, we're going to continue to support you with your poverty reduction programs, but you've got to take back your people.
That's right.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with that.
That's right. Just before we move beyond the Foreign Office, and I do want to come on to the new Cabinet Secretary and so on, and your broader thoughts, and indeed your thoughts about what might happen after the next general election. There's a lot of sense that if there is a centre-right government after the next election, the civil service could, revolt. The civil service could make it very, very difficult for an incoming reform government, for instance. But just on the Foreign Office, tell us about Chagos. Why is this happening? Where is this urge coming from to give away or to pay to give away British territory? A lot of ordinary people are completely baffled by this.
Yeah, and I think it's unsurprising that they're baffled, because the government have been all over the place in terms of giving a rationale, right? And it does often feel like the government's trying to sort of pull the wool over people's eyes on this, because they said it was all about international law and the requirements of international law, but then we know that International Court of Justice ruling was actually totally non-binding, for example. So everyone then said, well, hold on a minute, we're not obliged to give this island away. So, I think there's two explanations. One is that Starmer who's an international lawyer himself, just cannot bear to do anything that puts him at odds with the sort of international legal set, right? There's a sense that even if this ruling is non-binding, he just feels that because the international lawyers think that we should be giving this island away, he sort of reflexively is sympathetic.
Because there is chums.
Right? Because there is chums.
He was in a very trendy chambers in London, Doughty Street, very left-wing, it must be says, famously so, proudly so.
And I think Lord Hermer,
the Attorney General,
who has
his professional mentor for many years.
Exactly, and has an extraordinary amount of influence in this government. I mean, he's probably the most powerful Attorney General in many, many years. So I think, that is one explanation. This is all about international law. I think there is another explanation that's come about in recent months, which is that put out by people like Ben Judah, who was a former
advisor to David Lammy,
trying to make the case for this deal. And saying, actually, no, we really need to do this for national security reasons, because, it's the only way to sort of protect the really important capabilities on those Chagos Islands. And the actual details of what's there are highly confidential, and I'm not going to sort of break the Official Secrets Act by getting into that. But there is that explanation that's been offered. I mean, frankly, it doesn't stack up, because, it would be perfectly possible to militarily defend those islands if push came to shove. And if it's not, then, boy, that's a wake-up call, isn't it? I mean, if we're really saying that we don't even have the military capabilities to defend a bit of British territory, then, the answer to that is not to give away the British territory, it's to start investing in our defences and in our military and in our navy, right? So I just think, it's a surrender, frankly, to give up the Chagos Islands. There's no reason to do it. And even if you take, the sort of national security rationale for it and try and give the government the benefit of the doubt, all it really suggests to me is we need to get serious about investing in our military capabilities, because we need to be able to defend British overseas territories around the world. I mean, if you extend this Ben Judah sort of argument, essentially, would be giving up the Falkland Islands, and would be giving up Gibraltar, and we would be giving up all our overseas territories in time.
Do you think a lot of people in the Foreign Office want to give up those territories? Do you think some people in the Foreign Office are ashamed of the fact that Britain has these, if you like, post-colonial hangovers?
I don't want to say people want to give them away. But what I do think is that there's very little love in many parts of the Foreign Office for our overseas territories. I don't think they've been prioritised by our Foreign Office in the way that they should have been. I think they're seen as a bit of an anachronism, and I think actually the overseas territories feel this themselves.
They feel that lack of love.
They feel a lack of love and a lack of attention, and I think we should be doing far more actually to engage them, because actually, not just for sort of sentimental, nostalgic reasons, these can be incredibly important bits of territory. There's natural resources, to exploit. They're often in strategically vital parts of the world, so they have military value. But also in a world where AI is obviously the topic on everyone's lips. I mean, there's potential to build data centers on these territories, and I mean, there's a huge amount of untapped economic potential. And I'd love
solar and wind opportunities, run data centers, crikey, incredible.
Yeah, and a think tank out there should absolutely be doing papers on this very subject, because there's a huge amount of potential there.
Yeah. So let's go more broadly to the civil service as a whole. What do you make of, you mentioned Antonio Romeo earlier, the incoming cabinet secretary, a very high profile person. She's, for some people that's an asset, for other people it isn't an asset by any means. What do you make of the idea of her publicly setting delivery targets? Is that the civil service way? Surely she's just trying to show taxpayers that they're getting bang for their buck, no?
Yeah, I think, there's some merit to her publishing the objectives, because at least we can now hold her to account, right? On some level, right? If in 2-3 years she's patently failed, for example, to improve civil service productivity, then I think she should, fall on her sword, because she said in black and white in those objectives, she will improve and set out to improve the productivity of the civil service, which has been, flatlined for years. So there's some merit to it. I do think there's other parts of what she set out which feel like a bit of a power grab, right? So, for example, she's put in there that she is the Prime Minister's principal policy advisor, right? And, there is some, there's plenty of sort of precedent there. I mean, the Cabinet Secretary sort of has tended to be the principal policy advisor to the Prime Minister. But
policy sounding board.
Well, that's the thing.
I think.
Yeah, that's the thing. And this is where...
From all the Cabinet Secretaries I've talked to over the years,
yeah,
most of them, from all the political memoirs that I've read, lots of them,
yeah,
sounding board,
exactly,
not active advisor.
Well, exactly. And the other nuance is, many people would say her job is not to come up with policy, it's to focus advice on implementation of that policy.
That's right.
So the Prime Minister and ministers decide, as the elected representatives, what the policy will be. Her job is to advise on how to implement it.
That's right.
So I don't think it was particularly useful to have principal policy advisor in there. And maybe we need to sort of re-look at the job spec for a cabinet secretary to make that crystal clear, that their job is the implementation rather than, coming up with the policy. Because I think this cuts to the criticisms many people have for the civil service, right? Which is that they think that, it's their job to make all of the decisions. Whereas actually, under the British Constitution, unwritten as it is, but nonetheless, it should be ministers making the decisions, and then the civil service ruthlessly focused on implementing them. And actually, the implementation bit, civil servants feel is not very interesting, and so they much prefer. And the jobs in the civil service that are sort of sought after are the policy making jobs, rather than the implementation jobs or the sort of delivery jobs, which are seen, slightly as second best.
So in my travels, I talked to lots of senior politicians, and many people I respect and have known for many years have told me in good faith that they feel civil servants were sabotaging their policies, particularly people on the centre right, particularly after the Brexit referendum, a sense that, and this is something that Kemi Badenoch has talked about openly, something that Priti Patel has talked about openly, something that Suella Braverman has talked about openly, that civil servants were activists. They thought it was their job to stop policies that they didn't approve of. Do you think that's an exaggeration by those politicians, or do you think there's something in that?
I think there is something in that. I don't want to say, that across the board civil servants are frustrating or sort of actively resisting the orders that come from ministers. But I do think there's something a bit more sort of nuanced to dig into, which is that there's a lot of foot dragging. There's a lot of seeing only problems rather than solutions. Go back to the slightly niche example I was giving before about something as simple as getting food and drink in our embassies. The way that the civil service get around that, because they weren't keen on doing it, is not just
putting in British brands food and drink in foreign embassies.
Exactly.
You mentioned earlier that the lawyers said you can't do that, it's against procurement rules.
Exactly. Yeah. So and obviously this is not just about British food and drink. if we succeeded on British food and drink, there's a whole much more that could be done to make embassies shop windows for UK PLC, right? But the way that the officials sort of get out of doing it, it's not by outright refusal, right? Because clearly, if they did that, that
would be open sabotage.
It would be open sabotage, and they'd have ministers coming down on them like a pile of bricks. But the way they do it is by foot dragging, by introducing sort of obstacles, by seeing any problems rather than solutions, by outsourcing the decision to government lawyers who are incredibly risk averse and have become even more unwilling to countenance legal risk under this government. And I think Lord Hermer actually is in large part responsible.
The Attorney General, yeah.
The Attorney General, and therefore head of the government legal service. So they'll do things like that, or they'll even just wait it out. And this is another problem we have.
Because they know the minister will be gone soon,
exactly.
Right?
And we've got far too much churn amongst ministers as well. So what we saw in the Foreign Office is, Liz Truss was pushing this, and then James Cleverly was pushing this. But the officials could just wait it out until a Labour Foreign Secretary came along that maybe was a bit less seized of this agenda. So there's a whole sort of array of tactics that the blob can use. And I don't want to say that this is every civil servant, right? Because it's unfair to tar them all with that brush. But I do think there is a real problem of, the machine and the civil service sort of being insufficiently focused on a real sort of can-do attitude. There is a sort of inertia somehow built into the system. And it's not even individual civil servants' fault. It's a problem with the machine, which encourages them to act in this way.
We need a proper clear out, don't we? The civil service is a third bigger than it was in 2016. Civil service productivity, public sector productivity in general has plunged over recent years. The public sector is only 20% of the economy by employment, but so bad has public sector productivity performance been that it's dragged down the whole economy. Private sector productivity has been going up, not as fast as it should be, but it's still been rising. But the civil service, public sector is literally dragging down our headline macro numbers. What do you think will happen if at this time, when our public finances are really imperiled, when we're borrowing so much money, when we're paying more to borrow than any other G7 country because our public finances are so weak, what do you think would happen if an incoming government, say a centre-right government, came in and tried to seriously pare back the civil service? How would that play out, Ameer, in your view?
So I think, if it is a Reform UK government or a Tory government next, I think they will...
Or some kind of mix, who knows?
Some kind of mix. I think they will try and do that. I think there is a sort of recognition now that something is fundamentally wrong with the machine. I think, the Starmer government, I think even they have been sort of forced to confront this reality, because Morgan McSweeney, for example, was incredibly frustrated by
Starmer's former chief advisor.
Staff. Exactly. So I do think that, it seems very, very belated, but I think even Starmer is probably now waking up to the fact that something is wrong. I think they'll try and reduce headcount. I mean, they've already started trying to reduce headcount because it's so clear to everyone that it's just so bloated. But although they're saying that they're going to do this, the civil service overall headcount keeps on creeping up. So some departments are drastically reducing in size, and by the way, at vast cost to the taxpayer, because, for example, the Foreign Office and other departments have started voluntary exit schemes and voluntary redundancy rounds, and essentially is having to pay people tens of thousands of pounds.
Nice chunky payoffs that you rarely get in the private sector, by the way, along with your civil service pension that you rarely get in the private sector, by the way.
Exactly. So, the hopeless workforce management in the civil service over, the past 5-10 years, particularly since COVID and Brexit, has meant that we've just ended up with far, far too many people who now have to be paid off to leave, because clearly you can't just make them redundant and give them nothing, because you'll have all world of pain at the employment tribunals. So, that's not served the taxpayer well, but they will try and, I think, do that. But ultimately, I think much more is required. I mean, we need to drastically reduce the size of the civil service. We need to fundamentally change who we actually have in there. So far more people from the private sector, I think, are required. I think we need to stop this mad system of generalists where every 2 or 3 years in the civil service you inexplicably change job. So just as you're becoming fairly expert on fertilizer policy and farming issues, you'll suddenly be put in the Department for Education, for example.
Madness.
It's absolutely madness. So we need to totally change that. And all of this, which I think both Reform and the Tories will try and do, it is going to encounter a lot of resistance. But I just hope that they have the stomach to see it through, because this is really not just nuts and bolts and sort of geeky questions of civil service, machinery of government changes. Nothing that we want to do, and I mean none of the big things, properly reducing immigration, I should say, stopping the boats, growing the economy, fixing the health service, none of it can be done unless you actually have an effective machine, such that when the Prime Minister says we need to do something, it happens, right? And that doesn't happen without a civil service that's working and playing ball.
Do we need fundamental civil service reform? Is that the first thing that an incoming, determined, centre-right government should do? Really crack down on the civil service? Will it take primary legislation to do that, or can we do it within the existing legislative framework? And if we don't do it, will that then lead to a scuppering of their agenda?
So I think you're absolutely right that there has to be a plan. And that plan needs to be sketched out now, a really detailed, worked out game plan, essentially, for what the next government is going to do, say, in the first 100 days. Some of that will be primary legislation on how to tackle some of these civil service problems. But some of it will also be finding the right people to bring in. So, for example, Reform have said that they are going to get rid of all of the permanent secretaries. So the most senior civil servant in each department is called the permanent secretary. Reform have said they're going to replace all of them, right? So you need to have people to replace them with. You need to find people, talented people out there in the private sector, for example, that might be willing to come in. Or if there are existing civil servants, that have alignment with what a Reform government are going to do, and are capable and competent, maybe you need to identify those people so that you know who you can promote. But there's a huge amount of work there to be done, if you see what I mean. And whether it's Reform, whether it's the Tories, or so a combination of the two, I think it's absolutely essential, right? And I do think they are beginning to understand that now. And I hope that other civil servants, other people with knowledge of sort of what it looks like under the bonnet, help them, right? Because this is the other really important thing, Liam. I think one of the reasons civil service reform has failed is because you don't have many people who have seen under the bonnet how it actually works, willing to help make those changes.
Everybody inside the system has got an incentive to stay inside the system and to just, fill their boots, basically.
Yeah.
Big pensions, as I say, index linked.
Yeah.
Fantastic conditions of work when it comes to sick leave, sabbaticals, maternity leave, all way beyond what's legally required.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think it's not just the remuneration. It's also, it's an incredibly interesting job being a civil servant, because you have huge amounts of responsibility. But, I don't think the way we currently have set it up serves anyone really except the officials. I mean, it's fantastically interesting as an official to be in charge of, our embassy in Paris, and then to have a stint running our embassy in Japan, and then to maybe have a stint running consular matters in the Foreign Office, and then going off and having a little bit of a stint at the Home Office. But we do have this slightly mad system. I mean, that's a real example, pretty much, by the way. Matthew Rycroft, the former permanent secretary at the Home Office, when he took up that job as the person in charge of the Home Office, in charge of stopping the boats, until that point, he had never spent a day of his life outside of diplomacy and international development, right? Because we have this mad system where everyone moves around, and there's an idea that, subject matter knowledge doesn't...
As long as you've done classics at King's,
exactly,
then you can turn your hand to anything.
Exactly. And so that whole thing needs to be swept away.
Yeah.
But I do think it's very hard, to come back to that original point, I do think it's very hard for existing civil servants and mandarins to do anything fundamental about it, because turkeys won't vote for Christmas.
Politics is shifting. This Labour government, as some of us said when it was elected, will almost certainly be a one-term government, it seems. Reformer leading in the polls. It does feel to me, maybe your parents will understand this, you won't. It does feel to me like the sort of mid to late 70s. Which I remember. Big changes are coming, and a lot of civil servants I know, senior ones, are frankly quaking in their boots. What would you say to your former civil service colleagues? You're a very polite young man, if I may say so. I know you'll want to thank them for the honour of serving with them and all the rest of it, and Do give us those pleasantries. I'm sure you will. But what else do you want to say to them as somebody who's now outside the system looking in? Because it strikes me, a lot of people outside the system looking in, they've gone from scratching their head, confusion, to, frankly, amazement sometimes at how the civil service acts, and increasingly, what I hear is anger.
I mean, look, I think, as you say, I made friends in the civil service, and therefore it's been difficult leaving. I mean, what I'd like to say is this is not personal, right? I have no desire to just sort of throw mud at individual civil servants. But I do think that when you leave, you have a sort of special responsibility to speak up about the problems, right?
Especially when you leave literally in the prime of your life. I mean, exactly. you could have sat in the civil service, for the rest of your career and had everything. You were not only fast track. I've looked at your career. Within the fast track, you were fast tracked.
Yeah, I got to head of the British consulate in Russia.
Yeah.
I think, the record keeping in the Foreign Office is pretty poor, but I think, so I can't say this definitively, but I think that made me the youngest ever head of a diplomatic mission, for example.
Very, very impressive, and I'm sure you deserved it.
But thank you. But so my point is that, this is not personal. My criticisms really are of the machine and the system. And I do think that if other officials come out and decide to leave, they should use the benefit of having seen under the bonnet to try and help fix things. Because, I mean, ultimately, I have no interest in tearing the Foreign Office down. What I actually want to see is it once again become this mighty Department of State that was once the envy of the entire world.
And you do have an interest in the national interest.
Exactly. And I think if we can really get the house in order and win back the sort of support of the public, I mean, the civil service will be the greatest beneficiaries of that, because no one likes feeling that, you know, the entire public think you're sort of shirkers and you know, just there for the pension. I think civil servants feel quite demoralised because they know that out there the public, you know, increasingly are really critical of them. So I think let's focus on sorting this thing out. That will require really quite radical changes, and I'm quite sort of upfront about the fact that I'm in a pretty radical place in terms of what I think is required. But if we can fix it, you know, the civil service will be the better for it.
Ameer Kotecha, great to have you on When the Facts Change.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining When the Facts Change, economics and politics in a fast-moving world with me, Liam Halligan. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and my podcast via Spotify or the podcast app. And above all, please subscribe to my When the Facts Change Substack.